Microaggressions are more covert
Mm.
and minimized forms of aggression based on I'm gonna even take it outside the context of race. I would
Okay.
say based on another person's identity or
Okay.
multiple identities,
Okay.
right? So if we're speaking in the context of race, it could be something as simple as, or not even simple, but something as covert as a manager clocking you for coming in late
Mm.
consistently, whereas a white coworker who may come in late just as consistently or
Mm.
maybe even more
Mm.
is not penalized or
Mm.
spoken to,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So it's not a blatant form of racism, but these are like, again, covert forms that when you experience a multitude of
Mm.
these aggressions
Mm.
can severely affect your mental health because it
Mm.
contributes to that feeling of isolation
Right.
or being targeted in the workplace.
I like the way you broke that down. That was a really nice description.
Appreciate it. I'll give you an example too,
Yeah, please.
or another example. Like
Right.
when I started teaching,
Mm-hmm.
my first year teaching, I started teaching in special education,
Okay.
and so our special education program at the school that I was in,
Mm-hmm.
it had many flaws in it. But if I were to summarize it, it was basically a program to keep the students who got in the most trouble isolated from the rest of the students, whether or not they had a learning disability or behavioral disability. And
Mm.
so in my first year, these students have historically been lower performing students.
Right.
And so my first year, I taught them, and on their test scores, they showed improvement, but they were still, below average,
Right.
and weren't students who were succeeding. But I was teaching them with a few other special education teachers as well. So we
Right.
would like rotate for different learning subjects.
Right.
And my manager, like my direct manager,
Mm.
um, brought it was concerned about my students' test scores
Mm.
that were higher than my co-teachers who were white teachers,
Right.
white women teachers
Right.
whose students had lower test scores for the subjects that they were teaching them in.
Right.
But they weren't given that one-on-one. And I found this out later in speaking to them. I was like, did so-and-so speak to you about,
Mm.
how your kids performed? They're like, no, they didn't say anything. But then
Right.
I had like a one-on-one
Right.
based on my kids' test scores. And so even though that's not, my manager didn't call me the N-word or like,
Yeah.
it wasn't an overt form of racism or even targeting,
Right.
but just that, again, back to microaggressions, that covert
Mm-hmm.
way of penalizing you or targeting you or micromanaging or monitoring
Yeah.
how you show up
Yep.
and the work that you do
Yep.
um,
Yep.
can be a significant contributor to workplace stress.
Oh man, let me not get myself in trouble here, bro.
We're gonna leave some names out of it.
No, for sure. The names are gonna be left out for sure. Like, there's
Yeah.
no need for any of that. But like, I've had my fair share of like microaggressions, and I didn't even know they were microaggressions until like I had a training that I did at work, and like
Right.
you take these trainings at work, and you just kind of like speed through them.
Mhm.
But somebody was like, "Yo, I just took a microaggressions training, and it was really good." So I said, "You know what? Let me see. Let me watch this training."
Right.
And as I'm watching the training, they're going through a scenario where there's a woman that's pregnant,
Right.
and her manager is basically like saying like, "Hey, I know you had this big project, but I know there's a high likelihood that you're not going to be able to complete it because of the fact that you're pregnant."
Right.
Like that's a microaggression in itself. It's
Right,
just like
right.
you're basing the fact that she can't complete it because she's pregnant. And then
Yeah.
I started realizing, and I started comparing it to some of the things that I dealt with. I'm like,
Right.
yo, like I've dealt with that, like where
Right.
people give my manager feedback about my performance, and they'll say
Right,
certain
right.
things about like, oh, he asks too many questions, or like, he
Right.
doesn't go and do the research before. And so like I'll get the response or I get the feedback that here's a growth opportunity for you,
Right.
instead of asking a question or asking somebody to do something, you need to explain before you ask them like what you've done so that
Right.
they know that you've done something at least. And then you can ask them the question. And that's literal feedback.
So you have to justify asking a question.
You get what I'm saying? That's literal feedback that I've gotten. That you
Right.
have to justify the work that you've done first
Right.
before you can even ask a question
Yeah, that's wild.
or ask somebody to do
Yeah,
something.
that's wild.